Okay, so we discussed oligopoly and we talked about some game theory. And in terms of game theory, there are several concepts which are quite important. The first one is the definition of Nash equilibrium, right? So remember that Nash equilibrium basically says that for each player, her action has to be optimal given other players' actions. Right? And we also need to understand how to find out or how to solve Nash equilibrium in a particular kind of game, which is called prisoner's dilemma. A quick way to solve Nash equilibrium is to use dominant strategy. Remember that dominant strategy means it is the best strategy no matter what other players it is the best strategy no matter what kind of strategies other players are using. And then based on this definition of dominant strategy, we can basically find out Nash equilibrium, right? For example, in this common resources game, Essel's dominant strategy is to drill 2 wells. And Shell's dominant strategy is to drill 2 wells. So in the end, both of them will drill 2 wells. And this is the Nash equilibrium of this common resources game. Okay, now let's discuss the true-false problems. Okay, first one. Larger cartels have a great probability of reaching the monopoly outcome than to smaller cartels. So this is definitely false. Because for cartels, remember that the definition of cartel is like this. If several firms in the oligopoly market, they collude with each other, then we say these firms form a cartel. So here you can see that smaller cartels actually have a larger probability of reaching monopoly outcome. The reason is for oligopoly firms to reach the monopoly outcome, these firms, they have to sign contract and collude with each other. So if you have a larger cartels, then it means you have more firms in your cartel, which means it's harder for these firms to collude with each other. Second, in the case of oligopoly markets, self-interest prevents cooperation and leads to an inferior outcome for the firms that are involved. For this one, you can see that it is actually correct, right? Because first, ideally, these firms can cooperate with each other, and then they could operate as a monopoly. This will give them highest possible profit. However, self-interest will prevent them from cooperating with each other. And we have also learned the outcome, right? In the oligopoly market is actually inferior compared with the outcome in the monopoly market. To be more specific, firms in the oligopoly market, they charge lower prices and they produce more and they earn lower profit compared with a firm in the monopoly market. So this is true. Total profit for all firms in an oligopolistic market is larger than that of a monopolist. So this one is definitely wrong, right? Because we know that for firms, the highest possible profit they can achieve is under the monopoly market. Fourth, In the story of the prisoner's dilemma, Clyde is always better off confessing, no matter what Bonnie does. So this one is correct because we learned confessing to the cops is actually both players' dominant strategy. So this is definitely correct. In a competitive market, interactions among the firms are not important. This is correct. The reason is because in a competitive market, firms are price takers. So there are no strategic interactions between them. Sixth, when prisoners' dilemma games are repeated over and over, sometimes the threat of penalty causes both parties to cooperate. So we learned about this, right? We actually did a very little. So we actually look at a small example. In that example, we can see some numbers, and in the end, we can see that the one-time gain from cheating is actually worse compared with gains from cooperation. So if the game can be played repeatedly, then in the end, cooperation is possible. So this one should be correct. If all the oligopolists in market collude to form a cartel, total profit for the cartel is less than that of a monopolist. Well, this one is false because here all the firms in the oligopoly market, they form a cartel, which means they will act like a monopolist. They will cooperate, right? So in this case, the total profit for the cartel should be exactly the same as the monopolist. When prices exceed marginal cost, the result is a deadweight loss for society. So this is true, and this is pretty important, and we have talked about this for several times. So we said whenever P is larger than MC or P is smaller than marginal cost, then the market is always inefficient. It is inefficient basically means there is always deadweight loss. So only P equals marginal cost implies the market is efficient. By the way, the reason for this is, I know I have talked about this for several times, but this is actually pretty important. So the reason for this result is if P is larger than marginal cost, it means that if you let the customer to trade with the producer, then there is some positive benefit, right? And then if P is smaller than marginal cost, it means that there is negative from trading with each other. So you should reduce your quantity. And in the first case, you should increase your quantity. So in the end, you can see that under both these two conditions, the market is not efficient. Okay, now let's proceed to chapter 18. So chapter 18 actually talks about a kind of market which is different from the market we have talked about in previous lectures. In previous lectures, we always talk about the product market. And now, this is the first chapter we will talk about the factor market. Okay, so let's start with the motivating example. So in 2011, the total income of all Canadians was about $1.7 trillion. 75% of this income is in the form of wages and benefits. And then the rest, about 25%, went to the owners of land and the owners of capital in the form of rent, dividend, and interest payment. Basically, you can see that if you decompose the total income of all Canadians, right, you can decompose it into several components. The first one is workers' wage. And the second is rent to landowners. Let's say if you own some office building in downtown Winnipeg, then if you rent that building out, you will be able to get some income. And then third, interest dividend to the owners of capital. Well, here, I mean, the interest dividend to the owners of capital basically means investment returns. So let's say if you have $5, now you're the owner of capital. Here, the $5 means capital, right? So if you deposit this $5 in a savings account, so if the savings account have a 2% annual interest rate, it means that, well, after 1 year, you will get some interest income at a rate of 2%, right? And then if you use that $5 to buy some shares from the Canadian stock market, let's say you like a particular firm, right? Let's say you like Air Canada. So you use a $5 to buy Air Canada stock. In this case, then you will get some dividend. So if you have not learned about finance, dividend basically means that if you're the shareholder, so generally each quarter, this firm will pay you some money, let's say $1 per share, right? So in the case of Air Canada, it means that if you use $5 to buy 1 share of Air Canada stock, then Air Canada, this firm, will give you like $1 as a dividend each quarter. So basically you can see that if you have money and if you invest your money, you will get interest or dividend. So now we want to understand what determines these several components, right? How wages, how rental fees, how interest and dividend are determined. So that's our question here. So essentially we want to consider the factor market. What is the factor market? Factor is really a fancy name for input. So factor market is really the input market. That is the market for various inputs used to produce goods and services. For example, one important factor of production is labor, right? So now I am supplying my labor to the University of Winnipeg, right? And then the second one is land. And then the third one is capital. And I talk about this, right? So you can see that a firm, let's say a firm wants to make some investment. In this case, the firm, let's say the firm needs to borrow money. So when the firm borrows money, here the money means capital, right? Okay. To understand the factor market and to understand the connection between the factor market and the product market we have discussed in previous chapters, we can use this circular chart. So here what you can see here is we have two kinds of market participants. The first kind is firms and the second kind is households. So you can see that firms, they have two tasks. The first task is firms will produce and sell goods and services. And then firms will also hire and use factors of production. And then for households, right? Households will buy and consume goods and services from firms. At the same time, the households have a second task. They will own and sell factors of production. Okay, let's see these two markets. So this one is the market for goods and services. That is the product market. So in this market, firms sell goods and services. And households buy goods and services, right? So basically you can see the arrows here, right? It basically means that goods and services flows from the firm to the households. And then the households will buy and consume these goods and services. So money, right, flows from the households to the firms. And now let's look at basically in previous chapters, we always focused on the product market, right? So we always focused on this component. And now let's look at a different component, which is equally important. So this is the market for factor of production. So in this case, households are sellers and firms are buyers, right? For example, if you work for a firm, then you're essentially selling your labor to the firm, right? So in this case, you're the seller of labor, and then firm would be the buyer of the labor. So what you can see here is labor, land, and capital flows from households to firms. Firms will use the labor, land, and capital as factors of production. And then in exchange for labor, land, and capital from households, firms will have to pay money. And you can see that wage, rent, and profit will flow from the firm to households, right? So you can see that this is a pretty interesting chart. It basically gives you how money flows in the market, right? You can see that the outer loop, right? The outer loop tells you how money moves or flows, right? You can see that if we just focus on the outer loop, you can see that money flows out of household in the form of consumption, and then it becomes revenue, right? Connected by the firm. And then firm will pay out wages, rent, and profit to households. And again, households will use wages, rent, and profit to buy products and services in the market, right? And then the inner loop basically tells you how products and factors will work in the market, right? So here you can see that labor's land and capital will flow out of the households as factors of production into firms. And by using factors of production, firms will be able to produce goods and services. So goods and services will flow out of the firms to the households, right? And today our focus is about this bottom part, right? So we want to specifically understand how wages, rent, and profit, here a better word for profit is dividend. So how wages, rent, and dividend are determined in the market equilibrium. And then you might have guessed it, right? Because when we talk about the product market, we learned the market equilibrium, that is the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity are both determined by the force of supply and demand. And then in the labor market, the labor supply, right? In the factor market, the factor supply or the price of factor in the forms of salary, rental fees, and dividend. These prices, they are also determined by the force of supply and demand. So we can look at a very simple example. Think about apple and apple pickers. So first, we're looking at the product market, that is the market for apples. What you can see here is Well, this is a very typical analysis, right? So you basically look at the supply curve, demand curve, and then you will get this P, and you will have this Q, right? Which is very simple, and we have done this for a number of times. And now let's look at the market for apple pickers. Now, think about this market. Who are the suppliers? Well, the suppliers should be households, right? That is, or if you don't like the word household, you could say people, right? Or workers, right? So, who are the demanders? Who are demanding labor? Well, let's say apple farms, or maybe apple firm. I don't think you have apple firm, so maybe it's better to use apple farms, right? And then in this case, you can see that again, if we use the supply and demand, we're looking at the intersection, and then we will get the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So what is the equilibrium price here? It's the price of these apple pickers' labor, right? So this essentially means the price here is the wage of apple pickers. And then what is L? So L here can be considered as quantity of apple pickers, right? That is how many workers these apple farms will want to hire. Okay, now to understand this market equilibrium, so let's first try to understand the demand for labor. Okay, so first, what determines the demand for labor, right? That's our question here. A very obvious answer is you should know that firms demand for labor, right? Firms demand for factors of production. Now, the question is, how can we derive or how can we understand firms' demand for factors? Firms' demand for factors is based on its decision to supply a product in the product market. So basically this means product market will affect firms' demand for factors. This is actually easy to understand, right? So if the demand, so if the supply for gas is high, then this basically means that the demand for gas station attendance will be high, right? And then you could also imagine that if supply of coffee is higher, then this means that the demand for barista at Starbucks will be higher, right? So basically this tells you a firm's demand for factors is based on its supply. So that's why we call a firm's demand for factors as derived demand, because this demand is derived from the firm's supply decisions. Okay, so now let's use an example to understand this result. And we consider a very simple case. So we consider an apple farm. And this apple farm is competitive in both the market for apples and the market for apple pickers. So here, the assumption of competitiveness is basically, this assumption gives us a shortcut. That is, we can always consider this apple farm as a price taker in both the apple market and the market for apple pickers. So now we want to understand how this apple farm will decide how many workers to hire. Okay, so let's see how this works. So the first column gives you the number of workers, and then the second column gives you the output. That is, how many bushels of apple can be produced per week at different levels of labor or at different number of workers. And clearly, based on this, you can actually find out the marginal product, right? Because here we are talking about labor, so you can easily calculate the marginal product of labor. For example, if we look at these pairs, then it basically means that if the number of workers goes from 2 to 3, the output goes from 180 to 240. So you can see that the marginal product is basically 240 minus 180 divided by 3 minus 2, which gives you the number 60. And now you can see a new guy here, right? It's the value of the marginal product of labor. So what is this? So who is this new guy, right? Well, value of marginal product of labor is actually pretty easy to understand. So basically it means after calculating marginal product of labor, right? If you times the marginal product with the output price, this will give you the value of the marginal product of labor. And you can see that why this is called value of marginal product. Because think about this. Let's say, okay, first I guess I have to find out what's the price of apple. So what's the price of apple here? Okay, the lecture note does not tell us explicitly the price of apple, but it's pretty easy for you to see that P here, the price of apple equals 10. So what you can see here is, according to the definition, right? Value of the marginal product equals the market price of apple times the marginal product of labor. So this basically tells you the additional revenue the firm can get from additional unit of labor, right? Because MPL tells you the additional product this firm can get from hiring one additional unit of labor. Then if you times marginal product with the price of apple, this will tell you the additional revenue the firm can get from additional unit of labor. And this VPM, that is value of the marginal product, also has a different name, which is marginal revenue product. Okay, now let's see wage here. Well, we have assumed this firm is a price taker, right? So wage will not change, even the number of workers change, because the firm takes the $500 wage as given. And then let's look at the marginal profit. So how can you find out the marginal profit in this case? Now think about this. This value of marginal product tells you the additional revenue the firm can get from one additional worker. Now what is wage? Wage basically tells you the additional cost you have to pay from one additional worker, right? So you can see that intuitively, value of marginal product minus wage gives you the marginal profit. Here, the economic definition of marginal profit is the firm's additional profit from hiring one additional worker, right? And now think about this. If the firm is trying to maximize its profit, how many workers the firm wants to hire? Well, if you look at this, what you can see here is you can actually get this answer from looking at the marginal product. Right, so let me first remove these confusing marks. Now, what you can see here is as you increase the number of workers from 0 to, from 0 to 3, then you can see that the marginal profit always increases. Or to be more clear on this, what matters here is not whether marginal profit increases or decreases. It's about whether marginal profit is larger than 0 or smaller than 0. So you can see that from 0 workers to 3 workers, the marginal profit is always larger than 0. And then from 3 to 4, and from 4 to 5, the marginal profit is smaller than 0. So this basically tells you that as you increase the number of workers from 0 to 3, the profit always increases. But if you go past 3, if you increase from 3 to 4, the marginal profit is actually negative. So this basically means if you hire one more worker, when you have already got 3 workers, then your profit will actually decrease. And you will get the same result if you go from 4 to 5. Because the marginal profit is negative, it again means if you have got 4 workers, hiring one additional worker will reduce your labor, right? So just from this table, we can get this result. That is, 3 workers is the best number of workers for the firm to maximize its profit. Okay, now let's generalize this result here. Okay, so let me first state the result. So in this market, if a firm is maximize its profit, then it will hire workers at a point where the value of the marginal product of labor equals the wage. That is, the profit maximization condition for a firm is VMP equals W. Again, wage equals value of marginal product. And you can see that this is actually, again, easy to understand. Let's look at some other cases. So if value of marginal product is larger than wage, right? What does this tell you? It tells you that the revenue you can get from one additional worker is larger than the cost you have to pay from one additional worker. So this means you should hire more workers. Oops. Okay. I have to reopen this. Okay. Good. Okay, so this means you have to hire more workers. Now, if value of marginal product is smaller than wage, this means that the additional revenue you can get from one additional worker is actually smaller than the additional cost you have to pay if you hire one additional worker. So in this case, you have to reduce the number of workers, right? So this basically means the optimal number of workers you want to hire happens at this, right? So value of marginal product equals wage is the optimal condition the profit maximizing firm wants to use when it is deciding how many workers to hire. And I want to remind you that don't get confused by these profit maximizing conditions. Previously, we learned MR equals MC is the profit maximizing condition. And now we get a second one. What's the difference? Well, firms' decisions are different. Here, firm is deciding how many outputs to produce. So the question here is the optimum output. And here, firm's decision is different. Firm is deciding how many workers, the number of workers to hire, right? So firms have different decisions. That's why you have different forms of profit maximizing conditions. So don't get confused. Okay, by the fact that this formula gives us the firm's profit maximizing condition, you can see that, so we can first draw out the value of marginal product. So this this blue line gives us the value of marginal product. You might wonder, so why it has a shape like this? To be more specific, why it is decreasing as you increase the quantity of apple pickers? Well, you should have known this. Because we know that value of marginal product equals price times marginal product. So price is just a fixed number because this firm is a price taker. However, we have learned the diminishing marginal product, right? We know that if you increase the quantity, then marginal product will just decrease, right? So that's why as you increase the quantity of apple pickers, this value of marginal product should decrease. It's because marginal product decreases. So diminishing marginal product causes diminishing value of marginal product. Okay, so you can see that if you want to find out how many or the optimal number of workers the firm should hire, then you will basically look at the market wage. And then you will draw out the firm's value of marginal product. And then you will look at this intersection, right? That is the intersection between the market wage and the value of marginal product. So this will give us the optimal quantity of apple pickers. So basically what you see here is the value of marginal. So you can see that the value of marginal product will tell us the firm's demand curve for labor. That is, this blue line gives us the value of marginal product, and it also gives us the firm's demand curve for labor, right? Because by the definition of demand curve, if you tell me the price, I will tell you the quantity of, because by the definition of demand curve, if you tell me the price, I will tell you quantity demanded. And you can see that this blue curve will exactly serve this purpose, right? If you tell me the market wage, I can tell you the firm's quantity demanded. That is, how many workers will be demanded by the firm. So based on this reasoning, you can see that blue line is the demand curve for labor, right? That is, again, value of marginal product tells us the firm's demand for labor. Okay, now let's think what kind of factors, what kind of reasons we can see the labor demand curve shift. So we will talk about three major reasons. The first is the output price, the second is technology change, and third is the supply of other inputs. First, output price. This is pretty easy to understand. You can imagine that if output price increases, then the demand curve should shift to the right, right? For example, if the price of apple increases, right, then you can imagine that the firm will want to hire more apple pickers. So why do we get this result? Well, because we know that the firm's demand curve is determined by value of marginal product, which equals price times marginal product. So you can see that if price increases, right, then value of marginal product increases. It means the demand curve will shift to the right. Okay. The second reason is about technology change. And technology, so the effect of technology change on the firm's demand curve is actually ambiguous because there could be two kinds of technologies, right? So the first is called labor augmenting technology. So this kind of technology basically increases the productivity of workers. So this will increase the marginal product of labor. Then you can see that if marginal product of labor increases, this implies this will increase. So again, the value of marginal product increases. So we will see that the demand curve shifts to the right, right? So in the apple picker example, you can imagine there's some sort of automatic artificial intelligence powered ladder, right? With this very advanced ladder, this apple picker can be quite effective or more effective. So this will increase their marginal product. Okay. The second type is labor saving technology. Right? So in this case, you can see that if you have a labor saving technology, then this basically implies, just based on the name, this technology will actually save some labor for the firm. Or you could say this technology can actually replace labor. In this case, the labor demand curve should move to the left, right? So the labor demand curve will do something like this. In the apple farm example, you can imagine that robots become really cheap. In this case, the owner of the apple farm can just use robots to replace apple pickers. So in this case, demand for apple picker will definitely decrease, right? So in some sense, you can think that we're discussing complements versus substitutes. A labor augmenting technology is actually a complement to labor. And in this case, better technology, higher productivity, then the demand for labor will increase. In the second case, in the case of labor saving technology, we are essentially talking about substitutes. In this case, technology is a substitute for labor. So basically, if technology becomes better, then firms will adopt more technology. And because these kinds of technology are actually substitutes, so firm will reduce their demand for labor. Okay. Then the third reason for the demand curve to shift is the supply of other inputs. So this is quite interesting. It basically tells you that different inputs they're actually quite related. So here, the quantity of one factor will affect the marginal product of other factors. For example, again, in this apple farm example, you can imagine that apple farm uses two inputs, right? Ladders and apple pickers, or let me just use workers. Now you can see that if if the quantity of ladders decrease, in this case you can see that without ladders, apple pickers cannot effectively work. So this basically implies the marginal product of apple pickers will decrease, right? So again, if marginal product decreases, then firm's demand curve will shift to the left. So in this case, the demand for apple pickers decreases. Okay, let's look at this very simple active learning problem. So we are talking about number of workers, right, and bushels of wheat, and the price of wheat is $5 per bushel. The task here is we need to find out the marginal product of labor and the value of marginal product of labor. Okay. Let's see. So by definition, right, marginal product of labor is the change in the quantity divided by the change in labor. So I will just finish the first row. So here you can see that marginal product of labor is basically 1,000. And then the value of marginal product is price times the marginal product of labor. So now we have 5,000. Okay. Obviously, you should try to solve other rows, right? And next, it says, graph a curve with value of marginal product on the vertical axis and the amount of labor on horizontal axis. This is quite easy, right? As long as you can find out this value of marginal product and this L here. So let's see. So now we have the VMP curve, and we know that this curve is essentially the firm's demand curve. And now let's see this question here. Suppose wage is 2,500 per week. How many workers should this firm hire? Oh, this is quite easy, right? Because if it's 2,500, then we would see that the number of workers should be 3. So the firm will hire 3 workers. Okay, we discussed the demand side. Now let's talk about the supply side. First, we assume the labor supply curve is upward sloping. This is similar to the supply curve in the product market, right? That is, the supply curve would look like this. And this is pretty easy to understand. It basically means that if wage is higher, right? If we are talking about the labor market, then if wage is higher, then workers are more willing to supply their labor. Or you could say the quantity of labor supplied will increase. Okay, now let's discuss the factors or the reasons which could shift labor supply curve. There are 3 major reasons. The first is the change in the preferences to work, And the second is changes in alternative opportunities. Here opportunities means job opportunities. And the third is immigration. So changes in preferences basically means that if working is more preferred compared with not working, then you can imagine that the labor supply curve will actually increase, right? For example, in 1950, 34% of women were employed or looking for job. In 2009, the number had risen to 59%. So you can imagine that if you want to draw out the the labor supply curve in 1950, then it has to be below the labor supply curve in 2009, right? And the second reason that labor supply curve can shift is the changes in other job opportunities. Basically, job markets are interconnected. So the supply of labor in one market will depend on opportunities available in other markets, right? So here we have a example about Wall Street bankers and Wall Street regulators. So let's say if the wage earned by Wall Street bankers increases, then you can imagine that some bank regulators, they will actually want to change jobs. They will actually choose to work for banks. And in this case, you can imagine that the supply of labor in the market for bank regulators will actually fall, right? So basically, it means that if there are two markets, right, labor market A and labor market B, and if wages in labor market B increase, then this will put some pressure on labor market A. So people or workers from labor market A will just change job. They will try to leave labor market A and to find job in market B. So this will reduce the supply of labor in the labor market A. So the third reason is immigration. This is easy to understand, right? So if there are more immigrants, let's say coming to Canada, then the supply of labor will actually increase, right? Because now we have more workers. And then the side effect is the supply of labor in the immigrants' home countries will actually fall. Okay, we have talked about both the demand side and the supply side. So now we could talk about equilibrium. Remember that when you're talking about equilibrium, it's always about the intersection between the demand curve and the supply curve. Okay. So first, let me talk about the result. There are two main results about the equilibrium in the competitive labor market. The first is the obvious result. That is, the wage in the labor market will balance the supply and demand for labor. So basically, this means if a labor market is in equilibrium, then the quantity supplied of labor should be the same as the quantity demanded for labor. And second, the wage should be equal to the value of marginal product of labor. This one is also obvious, right? Because we learned no matter whether the market is in equilibrium or not, wage has always to equal the value of marginal product of labor. So here you can see that this is the market equilibrium in a labor market. because we have talked about the market equilibrium in the product market, so it's pretty easy for us to understand the equilibrium weight and equilibrium quantity of labors here. You can see that obviously the quantity demanded for labor and the quantity demanded for obviously the quantity demanded for labor and the quantity supplied for labor, they are equal. And you can also see that wage equals the value of marginal product, because value of marginal product is the same as the demand curve. So the wage here, right, W equals the value of marginal product at quantity L. Now let's think about how equilibrium will change if we have some shifts in labor supply or labor demand. So suppose that immigration increases the number of workers willing to pick apples. This is easy, right? In this case, you can see that we're talking about supply here, because workers, they're on the labor supply side. So what you can see here is the supply curve will move. Okay, let me use a different color. So so what you can see here is the supply curve will move to the right. So the equilibrium will be here, right? What you can see here is wage will decrease and quantity of labor will increase. And by the way, you can see why sometimes immigration policies are quite controversial, right? Because if you have more immigrants, the labor supply will increase. It will actually push wages down. Okay. Now suppose an increase in the popularity of a good causes its price to rise. That is, let's say now Apple becomes more fashionable, right? So people now love Apple. So this increase Apple's market price. In this case, if we're again looking at the market for apple pickers, now what we can see here is the demand curve will actually change, right? Because we know that the demand curve is given by the value of marginal product. So if apple price increases, then the value of marginal product will increase. So this implies we'll see that the demand curve shift to the right, right? So we will get something like this. However, you can see that we only discussed the shift in labor demand and the shift in labor supply separately. Obviously, you can see a more complicated question that both labor supply and labor demand will change. So in this example, you can see that labor supply increases and labor demand. So if we combine these two results, right, you can see that the new equilibrium is here. What you can see here is, for sure, labor quantity will increase. However, the effect on wage is actually ambiguous, right? Okay. Next, equilibrium in the markets for land and capital. So our focus in this class until now was about the market for labor. And now we want to talk about the market for land and capital. So more specifically, we wanted to think about the following question. That is, how the rental income and the dividend, right, are determined for the owners of land and capital. And before answering this question, we have to understand the difference between the purchase price and the rental price. So, I mean, this is like quite obvious, right? The purchase price of a land or capital is the price you have to pay to be the owner of the land and the owner of the capital. Here, the owner, as the owner of the land or capital, it means that you can use the land or you can own the capital forever, right? The rental price is the price a person has to pay if the person wants to use the factor for a limited period of time, right? So you can see that here we have different horizons. If you're paying the purchase price, you will become the owner. So you can use this asset forever. But if you're a renter, by paying the rental price, you can only use this asset, either land or capital, for a limited period of time according to your rental contract. Here, we will focus on the rental price. And you can see that, again, you might have expected this. The determinant of rental price for land and the rental price for capital is really the market equilibrium, right? So you again look at the supply and the demand, then this will give you the rental price and quantity. What you can see here is you have sort of different slopes for the supply of land and the supply of capital. So you can see that the supply curve for land is almost vertical, which is easy to understand, right? Because the amount of land is almost fixed. So that's why you get a almost vertical supply curve. Okay. What you can see here is the same kind of result we got. That is, the rental price, right, paid to any factor will be equal to the value of marginal product of that factor. So how do you get this result? Again, just look at the demand curve, right? Demand curve tells you, okay, let me use a different color. So demand curve tells you the value of marginal product. And now you can see that in the equilibrium, price equals value of marginal product, right? Because this point also gives you the value of marginal product. So this tells you that no matter whether we are talking about labor, or we are talking about land, or we are talking about the capital, then the price paid to labor, land, or capital should always be the same as the value of marginal product of that factor. And then a related interesting result is a change in the supply of any one factor will change its value of marginal product and other factors' value of marginal product. So we have learned about this, right? Because in the apple pickers example, okay, let me go back to this apple pickers example. So we have learned, okay. I have to swipe to the correct page. So we have learned about this. We have learned about this third reason. We learned that the supply of other inputs will cause the labor demand curve to shift, right? And we talk about this very intuitive example. That is, in the case of apple farms, if you have fewer ladders, then the marginal product of apple pickers will reduce, right? So this basically means that if there is a change in the supply of ladders, then the value of marginal product for apple pickers will change. So this basically means that the value of marginal product between different inputs, between different factors are actually related, right? So that's why you're getting this statement here. So that's why the lecture note says a change in the supply of any one factor will change its value of marginal product and other factors' value of marginal product, right? You could always use the example of ladders and apple pickers to understand this. Okay, let's see this example here. So this example essentially wants to elaborate this statement. That is, the value of marginal product between different inputs are actually connected. So let's say a earthquake destroys many of the office buildings in Silicon Valley. Now the question is, what happens to the earnings of these owners? What happens to the earnings of office building owners and the workers? So now we are talking about the rental income of these owners and the salary of these workers. And you can see that we're talking about two kinds of inputs or two kinds of factors here, right? So the first factor of production is office buildings, and the second factor of production is labor, right? And then you can see that by renting out office buildings, building owners can collect rental income. For workers, by working for a firm, by selling their labors to a firm, they can get wages. So the argument goes like this. First, you can see that the supply of office building falls, right? So you can imagine that because of this, the equilibrium rental price of office buildings will actually increase. You can see this quite easily. So let's say this is the market of office buildings, right? And you can see that the supply will decrease because the earthquake has destroyed a lot of office buildings. In this case, we will get to the new equilibrium point. And you can see that in this new equilibrium point has a higher price, which means the rental price for office buildings will be higher. And then you can see that this is essentially and you can see that on the surface, it seems that this is only about office buildings because on the surface, earthquake should only affect office buildings, right? But you can see that different factors, they are just related. And you can see that if office buildings get destroyed, then these office workers, they don't have enough office space. So you can see that in this case, these workers, they will have a lower marginal product, right? So this basically means that if now we're looking at the market of the market of labor, you can see that because the marginal product of labor decreases, then the demand curve will shift to the left. So in this case, you can see that wage will decrease and the labor quantity will also decrease. Okay, let's see this quick quiz here. What determines the income of the owners of land and capital the determination process is the same as we have discussed in the case of labor market. You will again just look at the supply curve and demand curve. So this will give you the rental income, and this will give you the equilibrium quantity. What would an increase in the quantity of capital affect the incomes of those who already own capital? Okay, this is actually interesting, right? So think about this. Let's say we're looking at the market for capital, right? So this is the market for capital. And then if there is an increase in the quantity of capital, then it means that the supply curve for capital will increase. So what you can see here is the quantity will increase and the price of capital will decrease, right? So it means that the income of those who already own capital will decrease because now the price for capital decreases. How would it affect the incomes of workers? So this talks about So this talks about the connection between different factors. And you can imagine that if there's more capital, and we know that capital is one important factor used in production, which means if there is more capital, then workers will become more productive. So in this case, the marginal product should increase. This implies the value of their marginal product should increase. So if you use the supply curve and demand curve, then you can see that as there's more capital, the demand curve for labor, for workers, should increase. So this means the income of workers should increase. Okay, that's for today's lecture.